"You will walk down that aisle, Beatrix, or I swear you will regret it." The church doors burst open, not with joy, not with flowers or laughter or the soft sounds of a wedding morning. They burst open because a girl was being pushed through them. Beatrix did not walk to that altar. She was carried there by her mother's iron grip, by whispered threats, and by the weight of a family secret, so heavy it had crushed her before she even had a chance to breathe. Her sister was gone, vanished in the night with the stable boy she loved, and now the most powerful, most feared duke in all of England was standing at the altar, waiting for a bride. And Beatrix was the only sister left. She had never met Alistair, the Duke of Ravenscroft. She had only heard stories that his eyes were cold enough to freeze a river, that he had buried one betrothed already, that men twice his size stepped aside when he walked into a room, that he never smiled, that he never begged, that he never lost. Her hands were shaking inside her gloves. The veil over her face was her sister's veil. The ring on this altar was meant for her sister's hand. Even the perfume on her neck had been sprayed there by her mother because it was her sister's favorite scent. She was not a bride. She was a replacement. And then she reached the altar, and the Duke turned. His eyes did not go to the veil. They did not go to the flowers, or the crowd, or the bishop waiting with the holy book. His eyes went straight to her hands, those shaking, terrified hands, and something moved across his face, not a shock, not anger, something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition. He leaned close, so close, she could feel the warmth of his breath through the thin lace of her veil, and in a voice only she could hear, he said, "You are not Elowen." She stopped breathing. "No," he said softly, and she heard something in his tone she could not name. "You are far more interesting than Elowen." And before she could run, before she could think, before she could do anything at all, he took her hand and turned to face the bishop. Beatrix Ashford had spent 24 years being the quiet one, not the beautiful one, not the charming one. Those titles had always belonged to Elowen, her older sister, the girl who could walk into a room and make every head turn without even trying. Elowen had a laugh that sounded like music. Elowen had the golden hair and the easy smile and the way of speaking that made powerful men feel like they were the most important people alive. Beatrix had books. Beatrix had ink-stained fingers and a habit of saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment. She was the sister who sat in corners at balls, the one mothers pointed at when warning their daughters about what happened to girls who read too much and danced too little. She had made peace with that. Truly she had. But nothing, not a single page of any book she had ever read, had prepared her for the morning. She woke up to find Elowen's bed empty, a note on the pillow, and her mother screaming so loudly the housemaids came running from 3 floors down. Elowen was gone. The note said only this: "I am sorry. I love Caleb. Do not look for me." Caleb, the stable boy, the one their father had dismissed 6 months ago after catching him and Elowen whispering behind the rose garden wall. Their father had called it an embarrassment. Their mother had called it a phase. Elowen had said nothing, gone quiet for weeks, and apparently spent those weeks planning an escape so clean and so complete that by the time anyone found the note, she and Caleb were already hours away. Beatrix stood in the doorway of Elowen's empty room and felt 2 things at once: a deep, aching pride in her sister for choosing love, and a cold, creeping terror about what was going to happen next. Because today was not just any day. Today was the day Elowen was supposed to marry the Duke of Ravenscroft. The contract had been signed 8 months ago. The Duke's solicitors had come to their family home with papers so thick and formal they looked like a piece of government legislation. The alliance between the Ashford family and the Duke of Ravenscroft was not just a wedding, it was a financial rescue. Their father, Lord Arthur Ashford, had debts, quiet debts, the kind that lived in dark corners and only came out at night. The Duke had agreed to clear every single one of them in exchange for the hand of the eldest Ashford daughter. That had been Elowen, but Elowen was gone. Beatrix watched her mother pace the length of the sitting room, and she already knew, even before the words came, exactly what was about to be said. "You will go in her place." Those 5 words landed like 5 separate blows. "Mother," Beatrix's voice came out smaller than she wanted. "You cannot be serious." Lady Marcella Ashford stopped pacing. She turned and her face was not the face of a grieving mother or a panicked woman. It was the face of someone doing calculations, fast, cold calculations about survival. "Your father's creditors come at the end of this month," she said. "If this wedding does not happen today, we will lose everything. The house, the land, the carriages, every gown on your back. Do you understand what I am telling you? I understand that you want me to deceive a duke. I want you to save this family. They are not the same thing." Her mother crossed the room in 4 steps and took Beatrix's face in both hands. Not gently. The grip was firm, urgent, almost desperate, and that, more than anything, frightened Beatrix because her mother was never desperate. Her mother was always composed. "Listen to me," she whispered. "You are 24 years old. You are not yet married. You have had no serious suitors. At your age in this society, that already marks you. But if you walk into that church today and you become the Duchess of Ravenscroft, none of that will matter anymore. You will be protected. You will have a title and a household and security that no debt can touch. And when the Duke discovers I am not Elowen—" He has never met Elowen. The contracts only specify the eldest Ashford daughter. You are not the eldest, but he does not know that. Once the vows are spoken, what can he do? Beatrix pulled back from her mother's hands. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "He can do a great deal," she said. "He is a duke." "Then do not give him reason to be. Be charming, be sweet. Be the kind of woman a man is glad he married." Her mother picked up Elowen's veil from the chair where it had been laid out the night before, pressed, perfect, and waiting for a bride who was now somewhere on a country road, headed toward a different life. "Put this on." Beatrix looked at that veil for a long moment. She thought about running. She genuinely did. She thought about grabbing her coat and her small savings and walking out the back door the same way Elowen had. But where would she go? Elowen had Caleb. Beatrix had no one. And her mother was right about one brutal truth. 24 and unmarried in this world meant invisible. It meant dependent. It meant a future that narrowed a little more each year until there was almost nothing left. She reached out and took the veil. She told herself it was just for today, that she would find a way to explain once the papers were signed and the debts were cleared, that perhaps the Duke was reasonable, perhaps he would understand, perhaps he would even let her go quietly once the financial arrangement had been honored. She told herself many things in the carriage ride to the church. She did not believe any of them. The church was full, of course it was full. A wedding between a duke and a lord's daughter drew every family with social ambitions within 30 miles. Beatrix could hear the murmur of the crowd through the heavy wooden doors as she stood outside with her father. Her mother was fussing with the veil one last time, pressing it down over Beatrix's face with hands that were now trembling. Her father said nothing. He had not spoken a single word since they left the house. He simply offered his arm, and his face was the face of a man who had made a choice he already regretted, but could not take back. Beatrix took his arm. The doors opened. The organ began, and every single person in that church turned to look at her. She walked, she kept her eyes forward and her steps even, and she walked the longest walk of her life up that aisle, with her heart shattering quietly behind her ribs. She passed faces she did not know, ladies in elegant hats, gentlemen in pressed coats, children sitting still for once, sensing the gravity of the ceremony. She passed flower arrangements so extravagant they reached toward the high stone ceiling. She passed candlelight that turned everything gold and warm and sacred. And at the end of it all, she saw him. Alistair, the Duke of Ravenscroft. He was taller than she had imagined, broader in the shoulders, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown. He stood with his back straight and his hands clasped behind him, and there was a stillness about him that was more commanding than any loud entrance could ever be. He was not fidgeting. He was not nervous. He simply stood there as though the church, the guests, the whole elaborate occasion were things happening around him rather than for him. He turned when she reached the altar, and Beatrix felt her breath leave her completely. His eyes were gray, not cold gray, not the frozen river gray she had been told about. They were the gray of a sky just before rain, full and heavy and waiting. And they did not look at her veil. They did not perform the usual sweep that men did, cataloging and assessing. They went straight to her hands. Her shaking, terrified, giving everything away hands. She watched his expression shift. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in the novels she loved, with gasps and declarations. It was a small shift, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness that became somehow even more still. He leaned in, close enough that she could smell him. Something clean and faintly woody, like a library that had been aired out on a winter morning. He was close enough that when he spoke, no one else in that church could possibly have heard it. "You are not Elowen." 3 words. Quiet as a whisper, heavy as a sentence. Beatrix's whole body went rigid. She said nothing. She could not say anything. Her tongue had simply stopped working. "No," he said, and the word came out slower this time, thoughtful, as though he were reaching a conclusion he found genuinely interesting. "You are far more interesting than Elowen." And then, before she could breathe or think or move, he took her hand, turned to face the bishop, and the ceremony began. She married the Duke of Ravenscroft with her sister's veil over her face and her own name nowhere in the vows, and the whole time his thumb moved slowly, almost absently, back and forth across her knuckles, as if he were trying to calm her, as if he already knew, as if this were not a surprise to him at all. The wedding breakfast was a performance Beatrix was not prepared to give. Tables had been arranged in the great hall of Ravenscroft House, the Duke's London residence, a building so large and so coldly magnificent that Beatrix felt like something small and fragile that had been placed inside it by mistake. Crystal caught the light from a dozen windows. Flowers that must have cost more than most families spent in a month sat in towers at the center of every table. Footmen moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing with plates and glasses in practiced invisibility. Beatrix sat at the head table as the new Duchess of Ravenscroft and smiled until her face ached. Guests came to congratulate her. Ladies with sharp, curious eyes pressed her hands and said lovely things with their mouths while asking entirely different questions with their expressions. Gentlemen bowed and murmured polite words. An elderly countess with magnificent white hair told Beatrix that she had heard Elowen Ashford was a great beauty and paused just long enough after saying it to make the observation feel like a test. "Beauty is a matter of perspective," Beatrix said, and the countess laughed, which was apparently the right answer, and moved on. Beatrix reached for her wineglass and drank more than she intended. The Duke sat beside her through all of it. He was courteous to the guests, attentive in the precise and measured way that told her he had done this kind of thing many times before and found it neither difficult nor enjoyable. He answered questions. He accepted congratulations. He made exactly the right comments at exactly the right moments. But between guests, in the small silences, she could feel him watching her. Not the way the other men in the room watched her, assessing her place in the social hierarchy or calculating whether she was worth knowing. He watched her the way someone watches a door they're not sure they should open yet. She said nothing to him. He said nothing to her until the last guest had moved away, and there was a brief pocket of quiet, and he picked up his own glass and said without looking at her, "You have not eaten anything." "I am not hungry," she replied. "You have been smiling for 4 hours. That requires energy." He turned his head then and looked at her directly. "Eat something." It was not a request, but it was not unkind either. It landed somewhere in between, in a place she did not have a name for. She picked up a fork. A small victory crossed his face, so brief she almost missed it. The guest thinned eventually, then disappeared altogether, and then there was the terrible quiet of a house that had just emptied itself of other people, leaving only the 2 of them inside its vast, echoing rooms. Beatrix stood in the entrance hall while the last carriage pulled away and tried to think clearly about what her situation actually was. She was married, legally, formally, completely married. The papers had been signed and witnessed. The vows had been spoken. Whatever happened next, she could not simply walk back out the front door and pretend the morning had not occurred. She heard his footsteps behind her, unhurried, deliberate. "Come," he said. "There is something we need to discuss." He led her to a study off the main corridor. It was a room that suited him, she thought. Dark wood, books along every wall from floor to ceiling, a fire burning low in the grate, and a desk that had the look of something actually used rather than merely displayed. He did not sit behind the desk. He stood beside the fireplace, one arm resting along the mantel, and looked at her with those quiet gray eyes. "Sit down, please," he said. She sat, spine straight, hands folded, the posture of a woman preparing for an execution she already knows is coming. "Your name," he said. "Your real name." There was no point in the pretense. She decided whatever game she might have tried to play, he had already seen through it at the altar. Trying to maintain the fiction now would only make her seem foolish on top of everything else. "Beatrix," she said. "Beatrix Ashford, Elowen's younger sister?" He nodded once, as though confirming something he had already known. "How did you know?" she asked. "At the altar. You knew immediately. How?" He was quiet for a moment. "I have met Elowen Ashford," he said. "Once briefly at a function 6 months ago. She was charming and bright and very deliberately made sure I noticed her. You walked up that aisle trying not to be noticed at all." It was a significant difference. Beatrix felt heat rise in her face. "Then why did you not stop the ceremony?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I chose not to." Those 4 words sat in the air between them like something solid. "You chose," she repeated. "Yes, I chose to proceed with a contract that had been made in good faith on my side," he said. "What happened on yours is your family's business. What matters legally is that the papers named the eldest Ashford daughter, and your mother made a decision about which daughter that would be. I decided not to interfere with it." Beatrix stared at him. "That is either very generous or very frightening." "It is neither. It is practical." He moved away from the fireplace and sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in a way that made him seem suddenly less formal, more immediate. "Let me be honest with you, because I find honesty saves a great deal of time. I needed this alliance. Your father's debts were not the only reason for this marriage. There are people in this city who have been waiting for a vulnerability in my position. A duke without a wife is apparently an invitation for complications I do not have the patience for. The marriage itself is what I needed, not a specific woman." Beatrix absorbed this. "So, I am a solution to a problem." "You are my wife," he said, and something in the way he said it made it sound less cold than it should have. "What that means going forward is something we determine together." She looked at him for a long moment, at the serious, still face, the gray eyes that gave away less than they took in, the hands that had held hers at the altar were the steadiness she had clung to without meaning to. "What is your name?" she asked. "I realize I have married you, and I know only your title." Something crossed his face, something small and unguarded and almost warm. "Alistair," he said. "Alistair Ravenscroft." "Alistair." She tried the name in her mouth. "I am Beatrix." "I know." And then, unexpectedly, quietly, like something he had not quite planned to say, "It suits you better than Elowen ever could have." She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing, and the fire burned low between them. Somewhere in the walls of that enormous house, the silence settled into something that was not quite comfortable, but was not quite threatening either. It was something new, something without a name yet. Later, a housemaid showed her to the rooms that had been prepared for the Duchess. They were on the east wing, separated from the Duke's rooms by a long corridor and 2 closed doors. Beatrix stood in the center of them and looked at everything that had clearly been arranged for Elowen: the flowers on the vanity, the particular arrangement of the room, the careful, deliberate luxury of it. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally, for the first time since the morning, let herself feel everything she had been holding back. The fear came first, fast and sharp and real. She was in a stranger's house, married to a man she had met 3 hours ago. Her family was somewhere across the city, safe now, their debts settled, their crisis resolved. Elowen was somewhere on a road with Caleb, building the life she had chosen, and Beatrix was here alone, in a room full of flowers meant for someone else. Then something unexpected happened. Underneath the fear, quieter but steady as a heartbeat, was something else. Curiosity. Because Alistair Ravenscroft was not what she had been told. He was not cold. He was not cruel. He had known. He had known at the altar, and he had chosen to take her hand anyway. And he had said her name suited her better, and he had told her, "I chose." There was something in all of that which didn't match the story she had been carrying into that church. She thought about his eyes, the rain-heavy gray of them, the way they had gone straight to her hands. She pressed her own hands together in her lap and sat with that thought for a long time. Outside the window, London moved on in its usual indifferent way, carriages and voices, and the distant sound of something that might have been music. The city did not know or care that a girl named Beatrix Ashford had walked into a church that morning as herself and walked out as someone entirely new. She reached up and unpinned Elowen's veil from her hair. She set it on the vanity. She looked at her own face in the mirror for a long moment and asked herself the question she had been avoiding all day. What happens now? She did not have an answer yet, but for the first time since the church doors had burst open that morning, she was not entirely sure. She was afraid of finding out. The door to her room opened without a knock, and Beatrix spun around, heart slamming. It was not Alistair. It was a woman, tall, sharp-featured, dressed with the kind of precision that said money and breeding in every seam. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the exact same gray as the Duke's. She looked at Beatrix the way one looks at an unexpected stain on an expensive tablecloth. "So," she said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. "You are not Elowen Ashford." Beatrix rose to her feet. "No, ma'am. I am Beatrix Ashford." "I am Countess Honoria," the woman said, "Alistair's aunt, and I have known about this family's deception since yesterday morning." She tilted her head. "What I do not yet know is whether you were a willing participant or a victim of your own mother's desperation." Beatrix held the woman's gaze and said the only true thing there was to say. "Both." The Countess studied her for a long, unbearable moment. Then she said, "Honesty, that is something at least." And she turned and walked back out without another word, leaving Beatrix standing alone in the middle of a room that felt suddenly very, very small. The morning after the wedding, Beatrix came down to breakfast and found 3 people already seated at the long dining table who had not been there the night before. The first was a young man of perhaps 20 with Alistair's dark hair, but none of his stillness. He was restless in his chair, turning a silver spoon over and over in his fingers, and he looked up when Beatrix entered with the bright, unguarded curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to hide what he felt. The second was a woman close to Beatrix's own age, pretty in a sharp way, with copper-colored hair pinned severely and eyes that moved fast and missed nothing. The third was an older gentleman with a white beard and a waistcoat that had seen better decades, who was reading a folded newspaper and did not look up at all. Alistair was at the head of the table. He rose when she entered, which surprised her, and gestured to the chair on his right. "My brother," he said, nodding toward the young man, "Julian Ravenscroft." Julian dropped the spoon, stood up, and grinned. "You are much more interesting looking than I expected," he said. "Elowen Ashford has a reputation for being rather obvious. You do not look obvious at all." "Julian," Alistair said, with a single quiet note of warning. Julian sat back down but kept grinning. "My secretary, Miss Edith Prynne," Alistair continued, indicating the copper-haired woman who gave Beatrix a precise professional nod. "And Thaddeus Wickham, my solicitor, who is apparently incapable of conducting business anywhere other than my breakfast table." Mr. Wickham lowered his newspaper just far enough to look at Beatrix over the top of it, made a small sound that might have been a greeting, and raised it again. Beatrix sat down. A footman appeared instantly with tea and a plate she had not asked for but was grateful for because it gave her hands something to do. "There is a matter," Alistair said, "that requires your awareness before it reaches you through less direct channels." She looked at him. "There is talk," Miss Prynne said, stepping in with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information. "It began last night. Several guests at the wedding noted that the bride did not resemble the descriptions they had heard of Elowen Ashford. By this morning, at least 4 households are asking questions." Beatrix set down her teacup very carefully. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that, if left unanswered, becomes scandalous," Alistair said. "And scandal in this particular social climate is not merely embarrassing. It has legal implications for the validity of the marriage contract." The word validity landed on Beatrix like cold water. "You mean someone could argue the marriage is not legitimate?" Someone is already arguing it, Mr. Wickham said from behind his newspaper. Lord Sterling Rathbone. He has been looking for a foothold against Ravenscroft for 2 years. This is exactly the kind of irregularity he would take to a magistrate. Who is Lord Sterling Rathbone? Beatrix asked. Alistair's jaw tightened just slightly. A man who believes he is owed something that I refuse to give him. The details are not important right now. What is important is that we present a unified and convincing account of this marriage before his version of events becomes the one people believe. Beatrix looked around the table. Julian was no longer grinning. Miss Prynne had a small notebook open and a pen ready. Mr. Wickham had finally put down his newspaper and was watching her with shrewd, assessing eyes. What account? Beatrix said. The truth adjusted, Alistair said. You are Beatrix Ashford, younger sister of Elowen. Elowen suffered a sudden illness the night before the wedding, and the family made the decision to honor the contract by sending you in her place with the full knowledge and agreement of all parties. Including yours? Beatrix said slowly. Including mine, he replied. I was informed before the ceremony. I agreed. The marriage proceeded with full transparency. He said it simply, with the calm of a man who had already decided this was the version of events that would stand. That is a lie, Beatrix said. It is a story, he replied. There is a difference. A lie is told to harm. This is told to protect something that is already real and already legal. She looked at him for a long moment. There was no guilt on his face, but there was also no coldness. He was looking at her the way he had at the altar, that direct, steady attention that felt like being seen rather than watched. And my family? She asked. Your mother has already been spoken to this morning, he said. She is in agreement. Of course she was. Beatrix pressed her fingers together under the table. And Elowen? Elowen's absence will be explained as a recovery period, Miss Prynne said carefully. She will be said to be resting at a private address. By the time anyone thinks to press further, the story will be old news. Beatrix nodded slowly. She did not love it, but she understood it. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief, that she was no longer in a position where her preferences were the deciding factor. All right, she said. I will support the account. Julian let out a breath. Good, because Sterling Rathbone is unpleasant, and I would rather not spend the next year in court. You will not be in court, Alistair said, with the certainty of a man who intended to make that true. After breakfast, Miss Prynne took Beatrix through a quiet but thorough briefing of the household, the staff, the schedule, and the social obligations that came with the title of Duchess. It was an enormous amount of information delivered in a short time, and Miss Prynne delivered it without warmth, but also without condescension, which Beatrix appreciated. Toward the end of it, walking back through the main corridor, Beatrix said, How long have you worked for the Duke? 4 years, Miss Prynne said. Do you trust him? Miss Prynne paused her walking for just a fraction of a second, then she said, He has never once given me reason not to. She said it simply and moved on. That afternoon, Alistair found Beatrix in the library. She had discovered it by accident, pushing open a door she thought led to the garden and finding instead a room that made her stop in the doorway and simply stare. It was 2 floors high, with a spiral iron staircase leading to a gallery above and books on every surface, not arranged decoratively, but used, leaning, marked, and stacked in the particular chaos of a room that was actually lived in. She had been standing in the middle of it for 10 minutes when she heard his footsteps at the door. You found it, he said. I was not looking for a garden at all, she said honestly. Something in his expression shifted. This was the room I spent most of my childhood in. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with his arms loosely crossed, and there was something different about him in this room. The formal precision he carried everywhere else had relaxed slightly, like a coat shrugged off at the shoulders. It shows, she said, looking at the state of the shelves. A librarian would weep. A librarian would have nothing to do, he said. I know where everything is. That is what people with chaotic bookshelves always say. He walked in and stood beside her. She was aware of the closeness in a way that was different from standing near a stranger. Something had shifted since the breakfast table, since the conversation in the study last night. The edges between them were not as sharp. "Are you frightened?" he asked. The directness of it startled her. "Yes," she said, because it was true, and she had already decided that lying to this man was not only pointless, but felt somehow wrong. "Of the situation, of Sterling Rathbone, of what happens if the story does not hold." She paused. "Of your aunt." That surprised him into something close to a smile. "Aunt Honoria came to see you last night?" "She did. She called me honest and then left without telling me what that meant." "From her, honesty is high praise," he said. "She dismissed the last 3 women I was expected to marry within minutes of meeting them." Beatrix looked at him. "How many women have you been expected to marry?" 3 before you?" "What happened to them?" He was quiet for a moment. "The first died, fever in the winter. The second changed her mind and married a viscount in Bath, which was the right decision for everyone involved. The third—" He paused. "The third is a longer story." Beatrix waited. "She was in love with someone else," he said finally. "She did not tell me. I found out 6 weeks before the wedding, and I ended the engagement myself." A beat passed. "I would always rather know the truth, even when it is painful." The words settled into the space between them with a weight she felt in her chest. He was telling her something, not just about the third woman. He was telling her something about himself, about what he valued, and underneath it was a question he had not yet asked directly. She thought about Elowen, about the note on the pillow, about her mother's iron grip on her face that morning, and about all the ways she had arrived at this marriage without a single honest choice being given to her. "I did not want to deceive you," she said quietly. "I know I did not have very many options." "I know that too," he said, looking at her. "I'm not asking for an apology, Beatrix. I'm asking for a beginning." She held his gaze for a long moment. This man who was her husband, who had known at the altar and reached for her hand anyway, who had called her interesting and meant it, and who had grown up in a room full of beloved and chaotic books. "All right," she said softly. "A beginning." Outside the library windows, London was gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Inside, the fire caught and held. Lord Sterling Rathbone arrived at Ravenscroft House later, and he did not knock. Beatrix was in the upstairs sitting room with Countess Honoria, who had installed herself in the house with the ease of someone who had always considered it partially hers when she heard the commotion below. There were raised voices and the particular sharp sound of a door being opened against a footman's resistance. Countess Honoria did not look up from her embroidery. "That will be Sterling Rathbone," she said. "I knew he would come eventually. I simply did not expect him to be so obvious about it." She set down her needle with deliberate calm. "Go to Alistair. Do not let Sterling Rathbone see you flustered. Whatever he says, whatever he implies, you are the Duchess of Ravenscroft, and you have been so since the morning of your wedding, with full knowledge and agreement of all parties. Do you understand?" "Yes," Beatrix said. "Say it like you mean it." Beatrix straightened her spine. "I understand completely." Honoria looked at her for a moment and gave a single approving nod. Beatrix went downstairs. Lord Sterling Rathbone was in the entrance hall. He was a broad man, red-faced, with the look of someone who had once been handsome and knew it, and resented that time had moved on without his permission. He was speaking to Alistair in the low, pointed tone of someone who believed themselves to be making a threat while maintaining plausible civility. Alistair stood completely still, listening, and his face was unreadable in the way stone is unreadable. He saw Beatrix on the stairs, and something in his posture changed subtly, an almost imperceptible easing. Sterling Rathbone turned to follow Alistair's gaze and saw her. His eyes moved over her with the calculating sweep of a man looking for weakness. "Ah," he said. "The Duchess." "Lord Sterling Rathbone," Beatrix said, coming down the remaining stairs with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I did not know we were expecting you." "A social call," he said with a smile that meant nothing friendly. "I wanted to offer my congratulations in person. The wedding was quite the occasion, though I must say several guests found themselves confused. The bride they saw did not quite match the descriptions they had been given of Miss Elowen Ashford." "Descriptions are rarely accurate," Beatrix said. I find people always imagine someone differently than they truly are. A pause followed. Sterling Rathbone's eyes narrowed slightly. Indeed, he said. And where is Miss Elowen now? I understand she was unwell. Recovering, Beatrix said quietly, as one does. How convenient. His tone was light, but the word was a stone thrown directly at glass. A sudden illness the night before a wedding. I imagine that must have caused the family some distress. Any illness causes distress, Beatrix said. We were grateful the arrangements could proceed without interruption. She felt Alistair move to stand beside her then, not in front of her, not in a way that removed her from the conversation, but beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched. The message it sent was unmistakable. Sterling Rathbone looked between them. The calculation behind his eyes worked fast. Of course, he said after a moment. How fortunate that there was a solution so readily available. His smile widened in a way that felt like a door being left open for a later entry. I will not keep you. I simply wanted to see for myself how well the new Duchess has settled in. He gave a bow that was technically correct and entirely contemptuous. Your Grace, my lady. He left. The front door closed. Beatrix let out a breath so slowly it was almost silent. You were extraordinary, Alistair said quietly beside her. I was terrified, she said. I know, that made it more extraordinary. She turned to look at him. His expression was still composed, but something behind it had shifted, something she was beginning to recognize. The small, unguarded movement that happened when he was feeling something he had not planned for. He will come back, she said. Yes, but not the same way, Alistair replied, looking toward the door where Sterling Rathbone had exited. He came today to read you, to see whether you would break under direct pressure. You did not. A pause followed. He will need a different strategy now. That does not sound comforting. It is not meant to be. I want you to understand what we are dealing with clearly. She appreciated that. The refusal to soften things falsely. What does he actually want? Alistair turned and walked toward the study, and she followed. He closed the door behind them, and this time he sat behind the desk, which she had not seen him do before. He pulled a letter from the top drawer and held it out. She took it and read it. It was dated months prior and addressed to Alistair. The language was formal, but the content was unmistakable. Sterling Rathbone had wanted a business arrangement, a significant financial partnership, and Alistair had declined. The decline had been polite and absolute. He took it personally, Beatrix said. He takes everything personally, Alistair said, leaning back in his chair. Men like Sterling Rathbone cannot separate business from ego. The marriage gave him an opportunity. If he can destabilize it, create enough doubt about its legitimacy, he creates a problem that distracts me and weakens my standing with certain institutions that matter for the work I do. What work do you do? Beatrix asked. She realized she did not actually know. Beyond the title, beyond the house, and the solicitor and the social weight of his name, she did not know what Alistair Ravenscroft actually spent his days on. He looked at her for a moment as though deciding something. Come with me tomorrow morning, he said. I will show you. That evening, Julian appeared in the library where Beatrix had retreated after dinner. He dropped into the chair across from her with the complete lack of ceremony that seemed to be his defining characteristic, and said, You handled Sterling Rathbone well today. Your aunt coached me, Beatrix said. Aunt Honoria coaches everyone, Julian said. It still takes something real to carry it off. He looked at her with open, uncomplicated curiosity. Are you going to be all right here? The question was so direct and so genuinely kind that it caught her off guard. I do not know yet, she said honestly. That is fair. He stretched out his long legs and looked at the ceiling. Alistair is not easy to know. I say that as someone who has known him his whole life. He's not cold the way people think, he's just careful. Things hurt him more than he shows, and he learned early to keep that very quiet. Beatrix was still. Why are you telling me this? Julian looked back at her. Because you are going to be here, and because I think you are someone who would rather know the real thing than the comfortable version. He shrugged. Also, because of how he looked at you today when you were on the stairs facing Sterling Rathbone. He looked at you the way I haven't seen him look at anything in a very long time." She did not ask what way that was. She was not sure she was ready for the answer. Julian left shortly after, and Beatrix sat alone with the fire and the books. The thought would not leave her alone, no matter how many times she tried to set it aside. She was beginning to want to know Alistair Ravenscroft. Not because she had to, not because survival required it, but because something real was pressing quietly against the inside of her chest. It had started at an altar where a man had taken her shaking hand and said, "You are far more interesting," and it had not stopped since. She pressed her hand flat against the page of the open book in her lap. Outside, rain finally arrived, hitting the windows in long, straight lines. The next morning, Alistair took her to the east side of the city. Not the London of grand houses and polished carriages and women in carefully arranged hats, but the other London, the one that existed in the narrow streets behind the beautiful ones, where the buildings leaned toward each other like exhausted people. Children ran barefoot on wet cobblestones, and the air smelled of coal smoke. Beatrix sat across from him in the carriage and watched the city change outside the window. He watched her watching it. They stopped outside a building that had once been a warehouse. It had been converted into something else now, with clean windows and a painted sign above the door that read, "Ravenscroft Foundation for Working Families." She turned to look at him. "You fund this?" "I built it 4 years ago," he said. "We provide apprenticeships, legal assistance, and medical care for families who cannot afford it." He said it without decoration, the way he said most things. "There are 40 families currently supported. We are expanding to 60 by spring." She stepped out of the carriage and stood in front of the building. A woman came out of the door, carrying a small child on her hip. She saw Alistair, and her whole face opened into genuine warmth. "Your Grace," she said. "We did not expect you today." "Mrs. Weaver," he said, and his voice did something Beatrix had not heard it do before. It softened. "How is your husband's hand healing?" "Well, sir, the doctor you sent was very thorough." He nodded, and his eyes moved to the child who was staring at him with round, solemn eyes. He reached into his coat pocket, produced a small wrapped sweet, and held it out. The child took it without hesitation, which told Beatrix this was not the first time. She stood beside him and felt something move through her chest. It settled eventually into something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. Inside, he introduced her simply as Beatrix, without the title, and she understood that was intentional. The people here knew him as a person first. She spoke to 3 women that morning, one whose husband had lost his position at the docks, one who was trying to secure a fair wage for her daughter, and one who was very young, perhaps 19, sitting alone in a corner with a specific stillness. Her name was Clara. She had come to London following a promise of work that had turned out to be a trap. She had escaped it, but had nowhere to go. Beatrix listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Beatrix said, "You are safe here, and you will not be alone." Clara looked at her for a long moment, then her eyes filled. Beatrix reached out and held her hand, steady and certain, until the shaking stopped. On the carriage ride back, Beatrix said, "Clara needs somewhere permanent to stay. The Foundation's current accommodation is temporary." Alistair looked at her. "Yes. Can we fix that?" A pause followed. Something in his expression opened in a way that was almost visible. "We can," he said, and the word "we" landed between them like something placed there deliberately by both of them at the same moment. That evening, Beatrix was at the writing desk in the library when Countess Honoria came in without knocking. She sat across from Beatrix and said, "Sterling Rathbone met with your mother this afternoon." Beatrix's pen stopped. "My mother?" "At a tea house on Regent Street." Honoria folded her hands. "Your mother left the meeting looking shaken, and Sterling Rathbone left looking satisfied." The cold came back, fast and complete. "He's going to use her," Beatrix said. "He's going to use what she knows," Honoria corrected, "which is the full truth of how this marriage came to be. If he gets her to confirm it formally, he has grounds to challenge the marriage on the basis of fraudulent representation." Beatrix rose. "I need to speak to Alistair." "He already knows," Honoria said. "He's in the study. He has been there since I told him an hour ago." She paused. He did not want to come to you with it before he had a solution. That is how he is. He tries to carry things alone first. Beatrix left the library. She knocked on the study door and opened it. Alistair was standing at the window, his back to her. He turned when he heard her. "You know," he said. "What is the solution?" He was quiet. "There are two options. The first is to get ahead of Sterling Rathbone's account by making a public statement ourselves that fully acknowledges the circumstances, but frames it as a private family matter handled with mutual consent, legally watertight. And the second? Your mother. She needs to not confirm Sterling Rathbone's version. She needs to choose the other direction. You want me to go to her? I think you are the only person who can." Beatrix looked at him. There was no pressure in his face. He was asking and holding the asking carefully. "My mother made her choice about me at the altar," Beatrix said quietly. "She dressed me in my sister's veil and sent me to marry a stranger to save herself from a debt she helped create." "I know," he said. "And you are asking me to go back to her?" "I am asking nothing," he said. "I told you the situation. What you do with it is yours." She breathed in and out. "If I go, if I convince her, what happens to her and my father?" "They will be looked after," he said steadily. "The debts remain settled. I do not punish people for desperation, Beatrix." She believed him. "I will go tomorrow morning," she said. He nodded, then quietly. "You do not have to protect me. You know that is not your obligation." "I am not protecting you," she said, and she meant it. "I am protecting what we are building." The silence that followed was the longest they had shared, and in it something passed between them that was neither friendship nor duty. He crossed the room and stood close. He lifted his hand and touched her face just once, his thumb at the curve of her cheekbone. "Beatrix," he said, and her name and his voice sounded like something he had been saving. She simply stood there and let herself be seen fully for the very first time in her life. The following morning, Beatrix arrived at her family's townhouse. She found her mother, Lady Marcella Ashford, in the breakfast room. Beatrix sat down across from her. "Tell me what Sterling Rathbone said to you." Her mother's hands moved to her teacup. "He came to me as a concerned party. He offered to settle the remaining secondary debt, the one your father has not told anyone about. It was a significant debt. If you confirm Sterling Rathbone's account," Beatrix said, "you destroy my marriage and hand him the weapon he needs to damage a man who has treated me with more genuine decency than almost anyone I can name. And I am his wife, and I am asking you, as a woman making her own choice, not to do this." "He will ruin us if I refuse him," her mother said. "Alistair will settle the second debt," Beatrix said. "I have already spoken to Mr. Wickham this morning. Sterling Rathbone will have nothing to offer you that you do not already have." Her mother stared at her, really stared. "You arranged that yourself without asking him first?" "He told me he does not punish people for desperation," Beatrix said. "I trusted that he meant it." Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, in a voice stripped of composure, "I'm sorry, Beatrix, for the veil, for the church, for all of it. I was frightened, and I made you carry it." Beatrix did not rush to minimize it. She let the apology exist. "I know," she said finally, "and I am more than all right." When she left an hour later, her mother had signed a formal statement for Thaddeus Wickham. Sterling Rathbone would have nothing. When the carriage returned to Ravenscroft House, Alistair was on the front steps, waiting. He came down and opened the door himself. "It is done," she said. "My mother signed the statement." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she apologized. His expression softened. "Good," he said quietly. They stood there as the morning settled. Then she said, "I did not go there only for the marriage, Alistair. I went because you looked at me in the study last night, like I was something worth protecting, and I wanted to be worth it." He took a step toward her. "You have been worth it," he said, "since you walked up that aisle with your hands shaking and your chin up, trying to be brave in a situation that did not deserve your bravery." Beatrix felt tears and refused to let them fall. He smiled fully, genuinely. a smile few had ever seen. He took her hand. This time it was deliberate, a decision. "Come inside," he said. "Julian has apparently attempted to cook something, which means the kitchen staff are in crisis, and we are needed." She laughed and let him lead her through the front door. The house no longer felt cold. Something real had grown in the spaces between hard conversations and quiet libraries. Inside, there was a minor catastrophe. Julian had involved footmen, a housemaid, and Miss Edith Prynne in an attempt to produce breakfast that had resulted in smoke, laughter, and a quantity of burned toast. Countess Honoria watched with profound resignation. "You went to your mother," Honoria said to Beatrix. "I did? And it is handled?" Honoria looked at Alistair, who was still holding Beatrix's hand. Something in the Countess's face released. "Well then," she said, "someone remove Julian from the vicinity of the stove before he burns the entire east wing down." Alistair and Beatrix looked at each other. In the middle of the smoke and the burnt toast, something quiet and permanent passed between them. She had walked into a church in her sister's veil, terrified and alone. She had walked out a duchess, but standing here with his hand in hers, she was Beatrix, fully, finally, and exactly where she was supposed to be. If this story moved you, tell us which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the altar, the library, or the steps this morning? Drop it in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if you have been here from the beginning, you already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. There is so much more coming, and you don't want to miss a single part.